I can't tell you how tickled I am that Frank Griffiths has introduced me, because if anybody knows anything about the Arctic, he wrote what I think is one of the most definitive public policy books on the Arctic. It must be now 25 years ago, called Politics of the Northwest Passage, and I reread it about 3 or 4 months ago and was absolutely struck by just how it stands up over that period of time. So he's kind of the guru. There's a whole generation of people that you'll hear on the radio from the University of Calgary and UBC who all talk about Arctic sovereignty, but it was Frank who really, I think, led us all down that path to understanding how important this issue is, and thankfully, we're starting to finally get it. I'd also just like to thank John Wiley and Sons, my publishers, and Robert Hickey, my editor, who's here, one of the most wonderful people I know and also a terrific editor, but they donated one of my books to every single member of Parliament. And I still don't know whether I get any share of that, but that's great, it's terrific. And thanks for hanging in. As you all know, that there was a bit of a subway problem, and so we're probably running a little bit late. So I'm going to rush this along so that you don't have to sit too long. My book came out of a project out of the Atkinson Fellowship in Public Policy, in which I was given about a year's worth of time to travel a dozen times to the Arctic to try to figure out how climate change was impacting the Arctic at a time when resource development and political interest was heightening in that part of the world. One of the big problems I had right off the bat was trying to define, well, what is Arctic? You know, you can say it's anything north of the Arctic Circle, but then if you look at Churchill, Manitoba, where they've got polar bears, it's a lot more Arctic than, say, Yellowknife, where I once lived, or Whitehorse, where I once lived. So there's many, many different definitions, and I think I spent probably a good month trying to figure this out in my head, and I'll share this with you in about 2 minutes here. But you know, the Arctic is glaciers and ice caps, as we all know. This is on Ellesmere Island in the Nunavut Territory. It's ice fields, the world's largest subpolar ice field in the southwest corner of the Yukon and Alaska. Huge, huge amounts of ice there that aren't going to disappear for several centuries. It's sea ice. If you're an Inuk traveling in the spring hunting polar bears or seals or whales and polynias, it's really important because it's an easy way of traveling. It's a lot easier to travel on flat sea ice than it is on rough surface of land. The Arctic is polynias, as I just mentioned earlier. Those are those open bodies of water that are surrounded by ice that typically stay open during the winter months. And when you think about it, in a huge area like the Arctic, it's really important to marine mammals because that's where they go to breathe. And so these are our biological hotspots that are scattered right across the circumpolar Arctic world. The Arctic is forest, believe it or not. It goes right up to the western Arctic coast and into Alaska. It's tundra and alpine valleys, as we well know. It's also really weird and wonderful. If there are any climbers here, they probably know about the Cirque of the Unclimbables, which are the fingers of God pointing to the heavens. Climbing Magazine rated this as one of the top 50 climbs in the world. It's on the continental divide between the Yukon and the Northwest Territories and the Mackenzie Mountains. It's the smoking hills which have been burning for 10,000 years. And a study done here at the University of Toronto many, many years ago examined this at a time when acid rain was really a big problem in eastern North America and tried to identify, you know, what the impact was on the environment. It's a lot of things that we don't know about yet. It's extremophiles living under 200 feet of ice on Ellesmere Island, and they are voraciously consuming something which is producing gaseous hot springs out of glaciers. And if you stood here on a warm, calm day on Ellesmere Island, you'd be knocked over dead by the toxicity of this. The Arctic is river deltas. The Mackenzie is one of the largest river deltas in the world, 45,000 lakes. Peace Athabasca Delta is one of the largest freshwater deltas. It's in the subarctic. The Arctic is also filled with magical or sacred places. And this is especially important to the Inuit, for example, at Ukuk-Siksalik, which is at the north end of Hudson Bay, and Wager Bay, which is one of the biggest inland polar seas. This is their Garden of Eden. This is where they believe that Inuk, quintessential man, got his start. And for them, it's a very important place. And nobody lives along the shores here. They just come to hunt each year. And as you can see by this, it's mesmerizing. It's really a magical place. And on the other side of the Western Arctic, there's a Thelon game sanctuary where the Dene believe that that's where God began. That's where he was born. And that was especially important recently at a regulatory review meeting where the people of Lutzelk'e stepped forward and objected to a uranium mine development project in this area because they said, listen, this is where God began. And of course, the energy people, said, you can't say that. That's not part of the mandate of the Mackenzie Environmental Review Board. It's not part of the regulatory review process. But the board in itself, which was headed by a Dene woman, decided, yes, it is, and they turned the project down. And it made headlines all over the place. And unfortunately, the woman, the chairman, her contract was not reviewed by the Harper government when it expired shortly afterwards. As George Lussey would tell you, the Arctic is also a lot of clean, fresh water. He's in the audience here. He's a legendary paddler, probably paddled more rivers than I think anybody in Canada. Holds a wonderful conference here on that issue and others every winter, and I encourage you to go to it. The Mackenzie, which is the longest river in Canada, the Hood River, the Horton River, the South Nahanni River, which is the Everest of rivers for paddlers in the world, the Firth River, which flows out of Alaska and the Yukon, the Back River, which is one of the longest tundra rivers in the world, 1,150 kilometers long. George will probably correct me afterwards, but I think there's something like 83 waterfalls and rapids along the way. It's a hoot. It takes about 6 or 8 weeks to paddle. I just came back from Chukotka in Arctic Russia, and the Anyudar River is 1,287 kilometers long. And the Brown River and the reversing waterfalls of Wager Bay, that sacred place that I talked about earlier on. Now think about it. Except for the Anyudar and the Mackenzie River, no one lives along these waterways. And all of the water is so fresh and pure that you can dip your cup in without fear of chemical contamination or any serious biological contamination. We have a resource here that we've taken for granted. And I think every cottager understands that down south. This is a tremendous amount of water flushing north, and it's still in its pristine condition. The Arctic's wildlife, Dall sheep, barren ground caribou numbering up to 2 million, muskox, Arctic fox, Arctic wolves, barren ground grizzly bears, which are about 2/3 the size of the grizzly bears that we have in the Rocky Mountains, and of course, polar bears. And it's also all of those animals, the polar bears, the grizzly bears, and the Arctic fox and the Arctic wolves eat, the Arctic hare, the ground squirrels, and the lemmings. And then we've got the visitors, those birds that fly by the millions to the Arctic each year to take advantage of all of that clean water in those lakes and rivers and all of that pristine alpine tundra and the forest, and they nest, largely unaffected by what man is doing. The red-throated loon, snowy owl, the sandhill crane, and one of the most endangered forms of wildlife in the world, whooping crane. There's only 14 left, or 210 left in the world. There were only 14 in 1942 when the last colony was discovered in Texas. The Arctic is big fish, like this guy that was caught in Great Bear Lake last summer by a friend of mine. It's a world record, 45 kilograms. Now think about it. This clean, fresh water that's largely unexploited is still producing monsters like this on a regular basis. There's also small fish. And finally, I think that Frank would probably agree with this, the most important definition of the Arctic is people. The Dene and Métis and Gwich'in of Alaska, the Yukon Northwest Territories, the Inuit of Nunavut and Greenland, the Inuvialuit and Yupik of Northwest Territories in Alaska, the Chukotkans and the Inuit of northern Russia, and the Sami reindeer herders of Scandinavia. I think if you're going to describe the Arctic, if you're going to talk about plans for the Arctic, about how to deal with anything, the wildlife, the fish, the waterways, you have to include them in the process. The interesting thing, though, is our concept of the Arctic is always evolving. I mean, it's not a hard definition. And we know this because if you look at history, you know, the Greeks believed that Arctos was the world that lay beneath the constellation of stars known as Great Bear. And that Boreas, the god of the wind that sort of stood at the gate of this place, whenever he breathed, winter would come to the south. And beyond these mountains in northern Europe, there was this mythical world that was situated along an open polar sea that was populated by Hyperboreans. Some believe that they were the people that inspired the little people of Iceland and Greenland and of the Canadian Arctic. If you ever travel north, they're always talking about these little people that are hiding under rocks and living under rocks. And in fact, in Iceland, there's a road that crosses part of the island, and it's a perfectly straight road, and it takes a little bend around this big rock. And the government diverted the road because they were convinced that little people lived under that rock. And many scientists, believe it or not, I mean, we think it's quaint, you know, that the Greeks believed in this open polar sea and the Hyperboreans who lived in that part of the world and 24 hours of sunlight that in a disease-free environment. But the fact is, right up until the 20th century, many scientists believed that one actually existed. And this was one of the things that compelled many Arctic explorers to go in search of the open polar sea, in search of the Orient, and over a shortcut to the Orient. And over a 500-year period, more than 150 ships tried and failed to do so. And we know what happened, especially with the Franklin expedition. They all pretty much failed. But you know what? The Greeks were right in a way. The Arctic was once warm. How do we know? Well, in 1985, there was a helicopter pilot by the name of Paul Tudge that was flying over Axel Heiberg Island, which is next to Ellesmere Island in the very high Arctic. And right here, just at the foot of these big ice fields that cover most of the island, he saw what he was pretty certain were tree stumps sticking out of the ground. And when he went back and he reported it to scientists, they were a bit skeptical. They knew that there was fossilized wood that perhaps came in from Russia or Alaska, you know, carried by currents. But when they went up, sure enough, there was wood there. Some of it was 22 feet long and 6 feet wide. And some of the cones that had fallen off these trees were so perfectly preserved they'd look like they'd just been dropped the year before. And this was 45 million years old. Here are the seeds and nuts. And also the amber from the trees was also preserved. When Time magazine actually wrote this story in 1987, the scientist in this case, Jim Bassinger from the University of Saskatchewan, was inundated by calls from people from all over the world, most of them who had seen Jurassic Park, and begged him for some samples of that amber, so if they could just maybe find a mosquito or something and extract the DNA, they could maybe recreate a world that existed 45 million years ago. Of course, that didn't happen, but what Jim was able to do was he was able to recreate that environment and found, you know, that there were animals like brontotheres living there in a forest, you know, downstream of a very lush upland environment, which is probably as warm as it is in Georgia today. So was this an anomaly? Well, shortly after that, scientists from the Geological Survey of Canada found evidence of this animal and other animals that had existed there 23 million years ago, a walking seal, the link between land and sea. And then, shortly after that, Dick Harrington from the Canadian Museum of Nature saw this stick, and he immediately identified the bite marks on that stick that had been taken from Ellesmere Island, and saw that they were made by a beaver. And he was particularly interested because in the Yukon, he had been digging up 8-foot-tall beavers that existed 100,000, 200,000 years ago in the northern Yukon. And so he rushed up to northern Ellesmere Island and then discovered that, no, they're not 8-foot-tall beavers, they're actually little 1-foot-tall beavers that shared a world where there were 3-toed horses and ancestral black bears and a whole host of animals that lived in a fairly warm environment. So for about 95 million years, we know that the Arctic was fairly warm. And then it started getting progressively colder, especially around 4.5 million years ago. And in time, we lost the miniature beavers and the three-toed horses and the 8-foot tall beavers and the mastodons, all because of climate change for which we were not involved. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe that the warming that's taking place right now is largely driven by greenhouse gases. I think that we are now the main drivers in turning back the clock. So I want to make that clear before I go on. So what's happening now that we are turning back the clock, so to speak? Well, you've heard this before. The sea ice is melting very rapidly. Glaciers are thinning. You know, you've probably also heard that if all land ice melted, the seas would rise by about 70 meters. That's about 230 feet. That's not going to happen in this generation or the next generation or the next generation after that. It's just, there's just no way it's going to happen that quickly. But if you think that if it rose just 1 meter, 240 million people in the world would be displaced and have to be relocated. This is the Lowell Glacier in the Kelowna National Park. The line shows where the glacier was in 1980 when I was working there, and it's receded by about 5 kilometers and lost probably 20, 30 meters of ice on top. The Britnell ice field in the Northwest Territories near that Cirque of the Unclimbables is the last remaining ice field on the mainland of the Northwest Territories. It's about half the size of the city of Ottawa. It's going to disappear by the end of the century. If these two scientists were standing at that spot in the foreground there in 1954, they would be under 20 feet of ice. That's how quickly it's receding. At the same time, we've got the frozen ground is thawing. Sea levels are slowly rising and storms are picking up speed. So you think about it. Without that sea ice buffering that thawing shoreline, those storms which are picking up speed, they're unstoppable. Before, they used to sort of break up the ice. Now they're breaking up the land, and as much as 18 meters of shoreline is disappearing in some places in the Western Arctic after a three-day storm. And as a result, Alaskan and Canadian Arctic communities are sliding into the sea. We know that the Obama administration recently announced that the community of Shishma Reef in Alaska is going to have to be relocated. They've already set out plans to do so. Tuktoyaktuk is probably going to have to do that within the next 20, 50 years. So is Aklavik. So are several communities in the Arctic world. Now, these melting glaciers are flooding rivers downstream now because they're melting so fast. But when they're all gone, those rivers and deltas downstream will become shallow or dry up. One recent study by Environment Canada suggested that 15,000 lakes in the Mackenzie Delta could disappear by 2050. A third of those lakes, if it continues to warm and dry up at the rate that it's been going. So think of the impact on all of those animals and birds that I talked about earlier on. They're all going to have to go someplace else to find that pristine water to nest on. If it continues to warm, more southern species will move north into a warmer Arctic world. Red fox are already starting to compete with Arctic fox in Alaska. We're seeing deer moving north, and what's following them? Mountain lions. There was a mountain lion seen on the Kelowna ice fields a few years ago. Now, mind you, it wasn't just sitting there looking around, it was getting the heck out of there. But there have been 40 sightings in the last 10 years, and obviously they're finding new territory. Now, many of these animals are also going to start bringing the diseases that they have adapted to and carry with them. So what does this mean for Arctic wildlife? Well, in some cases, probably in most cases, Arctic animals are going to adapt. But there's also the potential that we're going to have a catastrophic die-off similar to what happened when the Europeans came to North America and settled here and introduced all kinds of diseases to North American Indians. We know the story there. This scenario could unfold with Arctic wildlife. And we know that in one case for sure, two cases, is that beluga whales and narwhal have no immunity whatsoever to phocine distemper, which was first identified in the late 1980s in the Baltic Sea and has since spread into other Arctic and subarctic waters. And if it gets into the Arctic, we could see major, major die-offs. A warmer Arctic means the tree line will move northwards, caribou habitat will disappear, and we're seeing that already. 15 of the world's 23 barren ground caribous are now in serious decline, only 6 are growing. Not all animals are going to suffer. This isn't entirely a win-lose situation. Barren ground grizzly bears, those little guys, they're probably going to do okay. Why? Well, when you think about it, they hibernate now for 7 to 8 months of the year. If you give them 2 weeks on one side and 2 weeks on the other side to hunt more, to put on all of those fat reserves that they need to get them through the hibernating season, they're probably going to do fairly well. Because more food means more cubs, and more food means bears are healthier. And we're already seeing this. Grizzly bears are now moving into the high Arctic islands, and in some cases mating with polar bears. We know that because just a few years ago, a polar bear that mated with a grizzly bear produced a hybrid, of course, really adapting to the changing climate in the north. And what happened? An American hunter shot it. Biogeography, the end of biogeography. We're stopping evolution in this case. We're preventing these animals from adapting to this new climate. Musk oxen will probably do well. Squirrels and other small rodents will also probably do well because many of them now are producing 2 litters in a year instead of just 1. This is all happening at a time when the melting ice is creating economic opportunities, at a time when the rest of the world is starting to run low on energy reserves. 30% of the undiscovered gas and 13% of the undiscovered oil lies within the Arctic Circle. Now that's a conservative estimate because it's based on information that's largely 20 years old. And that's why the Harper government has invested $50 million over the next 5 years to try to use new tools to find out whether or not they can find new big fields in the Arctic. And there's a race going on. It's everywhere. It's in the Beaufort, the Chukchi, in Norway, and some of these reserves are huge. The Stockman gas development that the Russians own has enough fuel there to heat up all of Europe for 7 years. And that's why you see the Russians planting flags at the North Pole. Methane hydrates. There's enough fuel there in the Arctic that could become the next tar sands. And if there is this race for the Arctic, and I think it's already happening, slowly but surely, and I'm sure about to escalate, what's it all going to mean for wildlife in the landscape? Well, whale migrations may be affected by shipping, and the beluga whales in Cunningham Inlet, which come from Greenland every July, and they come into this spot, which is an estuary of the Cunningham River, and no one really knows what they do, but there's 3,000 or 4,000 of them. We know that they molt, they rub off their old skin. They may be giving their calves the chance to build up their energy reserves in warmer water. They could be hiding from killer whales, which don't like shallow water. The one I kind of like best, that's probably not the case, is that this is a beluga cafe. This is where they reunite every year and they communicate and get reacquainted with their old pals. I just throw that in because that actually comes from a scientist who speculated that. Just to give you a little aside, I was involved in this project of trying to figure out where these whales go once they get to Cunningham Inlet, because up until very recently, we had no idea. And so the 2 scientists involved said, okay, you can come, but you have to be involved in the project. You can't be just hanging around. And so I got myself a dry suit, and I was totally outfitted, had the knife wrapped around my leg. I kind of looked like, a young Jacques Cousteau. And the idea in this case was to wait for all the whales to come in, get into the shallow water. We would jump into a Zodiac, and we would sort of push one of these whales into the shallows. And my role in this case is that once they put a hoop net around the head of the whale, I was to jump on its back. And I was told that once you jump on the back of a whale, they go paralyzed. And that makes it a lot easier for them to put the satellite transmitter on their back. So I had a few days to think about this, of course, and it took a little while, but I was pumped. I was ready. And so as we were getting on top of this whale, I had it all planned. I knew that I was going to do it. I was ready, and then the scientist, in this case, Tom Smith, turned to me and he said, okay, You're all right, right? And I said, yep. And he said, don't forget the knife. And I looked, and I got the knife, but no one told me what the knife was all about. And he said, for Christ's sakes, man, if for whatever reason the whale takes off when you're on its back and your leg gets tied around the rope and you're going out to sea, you got to cut the goddamn thing. And I thought, no one told me that. And I just couldn't do it. I was like the kid, on the diving board, and he's screaming. He's not helping by screaming at me. He's just saying, jump, you son of a bitch, jump! And I just couldn't do it. And you could tell that he sensed this. So he turned to Tony Martin from the British Antarctic Survey, who had designed this transmitter. And he was sitting there playing with it. And he turned to Tony and he started yelling at him to jump. And then Tony looked at me, and then he looked at Tom, and he looked at me, and then he looked at Tom, and he politely said, fuck you. At which point, Tom lets go of the Zodiac engine, jumps on top of the whale, leaving us running around in circles. But he was right. Once you jump on top of a whale, they do go paralyzed, and they cooperate. And then they let go, and then they found out that these whales follow those narrow shipping lines within the Northwest Passage. So if we're going to have a lot of traffic going through there at some point, they're going to be running into these animals. Whether the animals move out of the way, we don't know. Fact is, no one knows what's going to happen. But think about it. What if we have an oil spill? It's not going to happen next year or the next year after that, but theoretically down the road. What if we have an Exxon Valdez-like oil spill? Well, Exxon Valdez was easy because they had an airport, they had a port, they had a means by which they could stage that cleanup. They could fly people in on a regular basis in boats, ferry them here, ferry them there. And we knew that they spent over $2 billion on that in 2 years, and they could not contain that spill. In the Arctic, we do not have those ports, we do not have those airstrips, we do not have the means to shuttle people around quickly to deal with this kind of thing. And we haven't had an oil spill experiment in the Arctic since 1981, because I know I was there. This is a picture of it. We are totally unprepared for that. And every single person that was associated with that project is now retired and gone. We've lost a generation of scientific expertise in this area, and we're not planning for the future. If the sea ice continues to melt, polar bears, as you know, will be forced on land. This is a family of bears that were found at Delaunay on the shores of Great Bear Lake, where that great, huge lake trout was caught last summer. They had to be shot by the local RCMP officer because they were trying to eat the dogs. Or they're going to have to travel farther to find ice in order to hunt seals, and this is seriously going to tax their energy reserves. The U.S. Geological Survey under the Bush administration predicted that 2/3 of the polar bears will disappear by the year 2050. And increasingly, we know that these hungry bears are going to get in trouble with people. And I'll just leave you with this. Another little aside is that I was also involved with this project of trying to figure out a way of detecting and deterring polar bears before it became necessary to kill them. And so this scientist and I were up on that tower that I showed you here on the coast of western Hudson Bay, and every morning we would get up and we would light a barbecue and we would fry up this rancid seal and walrus meat that stunk to the high heaven. But it drew in 20 or 30 bears every day, and we would shoot them with rubber bullets and plastic bullets. We would play loud rock music and throw firecrackers at them. It was horrible in one way, and in the other way, it kind of brought the perverse nature of the teenager in me. It was a lot of fun. But in the third year of this project, I got a little bit bored. And so I came up with this idea is, why don't we build a cage? I'll put myself in the cage to see what it's like to be confronted by a hungry polar bear. And this is it started off very nicely because the polar bears, they don't charge at you like grizzly bears. They're very inquisitive. They stop, they look around, they walk up very, very slowly and closely. They try to figure out what do we got here? Is this edible? And this guy started walking around the cage. And at this point, about 6 or 8 minutes into it, I realized that this 800-pound animal is walking on gravel and ice, and I cannot hear him move. I can't hear him breathe. And at that point, I realized why they're so successful in catching seals on the sea ice. They're incredibly stealthy, but it's also very spooky. And you can see that they're thinking. They're incredibly intelligent animals. And at this point, I think it was this point here, I realized this was the eureka moment. This is where he had a plan. And the first stage of that plan was to get up on top of the cage to see if there was a roof, or a roof, I should say. And when he realized that there wasn't, he got down and he started using that 800 pounds to break the bars. And it was at this point I realized I was in trouble, because the only person that could save me was the biologist with the gun who was in the tower, and I knew exactly what he was thinking because I had spent 3 seasons with him. Do I shoot a polar bear to save a stupid journalist? Or do I let nature take its course and say nothing? Fortunately for me, the bear ended up tiring of all this, went to sleep, and eventually walked away, which left me running back up to the tower, vowing that I would never do anything so stupid again, and I never have. So what does this all mean for the Arctic people? Well, it could mean pipelines and prosperity, which is important because I think many of them believe that their time has come. They want to share in the resources. Mines and money, really important when you have a fast-growing population, the fastest-growing population in Canada. But it's also going to be more dangerous to travel on that ice. It's going to be harder to find food on land. And it's going to be harder to find food below the ice. So why should we care? Well, think of the Arctic ice as this giant air conditioner that regulates climatic conditions down here. If that air conditioner goes on the fritz, our climate here is going to change. And we know this is already happening. Nearly a third of the 850 glaciers on the eastern slopes of the Rockies have disappeared entirely since the 1970s. And rivers like the South Saskatchewan that are dependent on those glaciers are now sending a lot less water downstream into the prairies and into the Arctic. And this is making the prairies more vulnerable to drought. And we've also seen the mountain pine beetle and the spruce bark beetle take hold, destroying tens of millions of hectares of forest. I think the cost to BC alone has been in the range of $30 billion. And these dead forests are intensifying forest fires. Huge economic costs. Well, solutions, there's an awful lot of them. You know, give credit to the Harper government. They've created some national parks and expanded others in the north. They're now talking seriously, I hope, about a national marine conservation area in Lancaster Sound. But we need to map more of those biological hotspots in the Arctic. We need to invest in climate change science. The Canadian Foundation on Climate Change Research is going to run out of money this year, and there's nothing so far to replace it. We also need, I should point out, I think, to engage the Inuit and the Dene in the discussion. If we're going to have a national discussion about the future, we have to have the inhabitants at the table in the decision-making process. We can't just nod to them and give them a say and then ignore them. They really have to be involved. You know, because the Arctic is not easily understood. Think back to the Greeks and to the explorers and to the time where we thought the Arctic was always cold. That concept is always evolving because it's a place that's not easily understood. These are hills on Victoria Island in the high Arctic. My wife and I did the Kujawa River several years ago, and we saw these hills in the distance. And they weren't marked on the map, which really didn't mean anything because the maps were fairly superficial, but we thought we'd walk out to them one night. This is 8 kilometers away. Anyone want to guess just how far they are? I'll give you a hint. This is 4 kilometers away. 2 kilometers away. 1 kilometer away, 100 meters. This is how high they are. And I use this series of photos to illustrate that our way of seeing isn't necessarily the correct way of seeing. You know, we can trust our understanding only to a certain point. And I think that we have to look at other ways of seeing the Arctic to really fully understand it. And I think that we are a long, long way off from that.